Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon at this point. If you're on the East Coast, if you're not, I guess it's still morning. Um, Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give a minute to let all the attendees into the room and we'll get started. Appreciate your patience. All right. Thanks. Welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today for this press briefing. I'm John Whiten, the Deputy Director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and I'm thrilled to be sharing the pending release of the latest edition of our comprehensive Who Pays report with you today. This report is the product of many thousands of hours of work by our team at ITEP, as well as many of our former colleagues. It is a truly remarkable piece of research and the only distributional analysis of tax systems in all 50 states and DC that exists, period. In other words, this report measures how regressive the tax code is in every state by determining the share of income that families across the income distribution pay in state and local taxes. This edition is the best we've done yet, both in terms of the accuracy and completeness of the data, but also in terms of the additional context we've added in. To the first point, this edition includes 99.7% of all state and local taxes in the analysis. And to the second point, it includes not only a point in time snapshot of the tax system in every state, but it also includes 34 alternative analyses for select states that show either how the tax code has changed in recent years, how it will change in coming years, or how certain proposals would change it in the future. Today, we're going to have 3 panelists on this briefing, as well as another expert from ITEP on hand for the question and answer period. I'll introduce them all in a moment, but first, I want to give you a roadmap for the briefing. We're going to hear first from the panelists and then open the floor up to questions from all of you. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom or raise your hand to ask a question and we can unmute you to verbally ask it. You can also put questions in the chat, though we may be less likely to see those. We are recording this briefing and can provide a copy of the recording to you after the fact as well. I want to remind you all that the Who Pays report and everything said during this briefing are embargoed until 12:01 a.m. East Coast time tomorrow, Tuesday, January 9th. Our panelists today will be Carl Davis, ITEP's research director and the project lead on Who Pays, Phineas Baxandall, the interim president of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, and Siddharth Knight, the CEO of the Florida Policy Institute. We're also joined by ITEP's State Policy Director, Aidan Davis. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Carl.
Yeah, thank you, John. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. So as John alluded to, this report has just been an absolutely massive undertaking involving pretty much everyone on our staff in some way. And we're just beyond thrilled to be able to share this with you today. The tax model that we've built and maintained allows for a comprehensive understanding of who is paying how much in state and local taxes. And when we look at how states are taxing their residents, it's clear that they're falling very far short of what most people consider to be a fair tax code. What I mean by that is when you ask people what tax fairness means to them, everyone pretty much sorts themselves into 2 camps. The first is a group of people who say they like flat taxes because that means everyone's going to pay the same. And the second is a group that likes progressive taxes, where the rich pay more because they can afford to pay and because they owe some of their good fortune to the public services and the social stability that government provides. But then when you look at state and local tax systems, the vast majority of them are neither of these things. So we have a slide with the national average distribution of state and local tax. Most state tax systems are regressive, meaning the less you make, the more you pay. A lot of times we'll call this an upside down tax code because it's the exact opposite of the kind of progressive taxation that a huge swath of the public supports. Frankly, the states are failing to deliver the kinds of tax policies the public wants. And a case in point there is Florida, which we've determined has the most regressive tax code in the nation today. And we'll be hearing from Siddharth Knight in just a minute with some more detail on that. But more generally, from a national perspective, how is it that states are failing so miserably on this front? You know, the core problem is not that complicated. The problem is that state and local governments are raising most of their tax revenue from regressive taxes on what people buy or on their homes that they own or rent. And those expenses swallow up a larger share of income for low and middle income people. You know, for most families, sales and excise taxes charged on the things they're buying are the largest state tax expense they pay. And you can see that pretty clearly in the next chart. You know, most people don't realize this because it's spread across so many little purchases all throughout the year. But when you add up all the taxes being charged on your clothing, utilities, phone bill, the gas you use to get to work, it really adds up, especially for families facing difficult economic circumstances. And the same is true of property taxes to a somewhat lesser extent. And those come primarily from taxing people's homes. And it's no secret that middle income and lower income people have to spend more of their earnings on housing toward putting a roof over their heads. And so if you levy a tax on that housing, it's almost inevitably going to swallow up a larger share of income for those families than it will for the wealthy. There's also a growing body of work pointing toward an additional problem with the property tax, which is that property values are being mismeasured in ways that favor high value homes and cause lower value homes to be taxed at lower rates. And this is really compounding the problem, and it's introducing a lot of inequity along both economic and racial lines. So we have all these regressive sales and property taxes. These exist in every state. And a lot of the variation across states then comes down to how much they do to offset those highly regressive taxes with other kinds of progressive tax measures like income taxes or estate taxes. So, for example, the most progressive tax jurisdictions in the country are DC and Minnesota. And if you look at those systems, and we have a slide here showing them, you don't see a steeply progressive tax code in either of these places. But you do see systems that look meaningfully different from the average state or from a state like Florida. These are places that have progressive elements through at least some parts of the income scale. And how do they manage that? Well, it's a combination of two things. The first is that these are places with strong refundable credits. DC and Minnesota both have earned income tax credits and property tax circuit breakers, both of which provide meaningful tax cuts to lower income families. The second thing is that these are both places with robust personal income taxes that really do ask more of high income earners. There are a lot of states that have income taxes that are either flat with just one tax rate or that come pretty close to being flat in practice. But that's not the case in DC or Minnesota or any of the other states that we've determined have less regressive tax codes. So these findings, and we have a slide with the national overview, they have a lot of relevance to the tax policy debates that are occurring in state houses everywhere right now. You know, it's very likely that tomorrow, for example, when Governor Reynolds gives her State of the State address in Iowa, she's going to call again for repealing her state's personal income tax. And our report shows that this would be a very substantial tax cut for Iowa's wealthiest families and would leave Iowa with the sixth most regressive tax code in the nation. There's been a lot of interest lately in cutting personal income taxes, and we have a series of analyses in this report showing how states like Arkansas, Kentucky, Nebraska, North Carolina, and others are on a path toward even more regressive tax codes. We also have numbers showing, though, that some states have charted a very different course here. New Mexico improved dramatically from the last edition of the study through enactment of a child tax credit, stronger taxes on capital gains, and a new bracket on top incomes. Minnesota as well, they passed significant legislation last year affecting capital gains, corporate income taxes, and low income credits that really made a difference in the state's results. And of course, we'll be hearing more about Massachusetts in just a minute from Phineas, where stronger low income credits and taxes on top incomes have really moved the needle on the distribution of their tax system. So what we see from all this movement is that regressive taxation is not inevitable. This is a policy choice. State lawmakers make choices all the time that determine just how regressive or progressive their state's tax system is going to be. And our hope with this report is that lawmakers and the public can be informed about where state tax codes stand today and what would have to happen to get to a place that comes closer to living up to most people's idea of fairness. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come learn a little bit about our research here.
Thanks so much, Carl, for that overview. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sadaf Knight, who is the CEO of Florida Policy Institute. As Carl mentioned, Florida in this edition comes in as the most regressive state in the nation. So Sadaf's going to talk a little bit about why that is and what her organization and others in the state are trying to do to change that. Sadaf.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here and for having me speak here today. So Florida is known as a low tax state. It's part of our identity and something that people really tout as something as why people should live in Florida. And a key part of that is our lack of a personal income tax. That also is something that's a key part of our identity and a driver of our inequitable tax code. And I just want to start by putting that into context. Carl mentioned that that being regressive is not accidental and that it's policy choices over time. And we've done a lot of work to kind of highlight what those choices have been. So just looking at the personal income tax, it was eliminated in the early 1920s as a constitutional amendment. And this was during a time when Florida was really growing. There was a high period of high speculation and a sort of frenzy around development. And of course, just a few years after this was passed, there was a bust. And so that promise of wealth and growth didn't really materialize. But what we were stuck with and what remained was this ban on a personal income tax. This has had a tremendous impact on our ability to raise revenue in Florida. It has impacted how we think about that in our state, and also has had an impact on inequity when it comes to funding public services and expanding economic opportunity. In the many years since then, there have been other changes to our tax code that have been very impactful, things like adopting the sales tax, which we heavily rely on, another key driver of inequity in Florida, and adopting the corporate income tax. Those are just a couple of the big changes that have happened and that influence our tax code today. And even though the legislature over the years has continued to cut corporate income taxes, there have still been some measures passed that have worked to sort of ease the burden on low and moderate income Floridians. On the more proactive side, just one example from last year was making permanent a sales tax exemption on diapers and incontinence products. On the defensive side, a coalition of partners and advocates from across the state worked to defeat a huge tax cut package in 2022 that would have cost the state $3.5 billion. And while these are sort of, the next thing is sort of neither here nor there, the state passes sales tax holidays every year, and that FPI is not really a proponent of these. They're not super effective and they don't provide targeted relief to low-income Floridians. They do kind of represent a tacit acknowledgement that something needs to be done about our tax code to relieve the burden on everyday Floridians, because it is the burden is very high. So the Who Pays report really helps us to reframe the narrative of Florida as a low tax state. We think this resonates because the actual experiences of Floridians who are struggling with such a high cost of living, with affordability really being through the roof, doesn't match up to that reputation of it being a low cost state, or that reputation of that our economy is booming. And we believe that there's an understanding and willingness among Floridians to raise revenue to invest in public services and programs that will benefit all of us. In fact, when we look at how Floridians actually vote when it comes to ballot measures and local referenda, they by and large vote for tax increases. The corporate income tax that I just mentioned was adopted by another constitutional amendment. Florida's voted for that overwhelmingly in the early 1970s. And then on the local end of things, since 2010, Floridians have voted to increase their taxes 142 times. In 2021 and 2022, local tax referenda that passed totaled $2.2 billion. Our top priority for FPI right now is pushing for a state level earned income tax credit, which we call a working Floridians tax rebate. This is an idea that has had bipartisan support over the past several years. A bill has been introduced this session with bipartisan support. And we're, this is part of a long-term idea for FPI and a campaign that we'll be working on for a while. But this would, be pegged at the federal EITC at 20%, and we estimate it would bring $513 per household to about 1.6 million households across Florida. We also play a key role in broadening the conversation around revenue and investments, providing tax policy expertise to show that there are ways that Florida can raise revenue in equitable ways to fund all of our shared priorities. We've published a revenue menu of 14 different policy measures that, if all of them were enacted, would raise $3.5 billion. One in particular is combined reporting. Again, this is an idea that's a long-term one for FPI, but bills have been introduced over the years, and we expect so again, and this would raise $1.1 billion if it was enacted. On the defensive side, we work to push back against further corporate tax cuts when we participate in coalition efforts to increase transparency on the corporate income tax, looking at who pays and who doesn't pay through efforts like the People's Budget. So just to conclude, I wanted to say that even though we are the most regressive in the country as of this latest report, we do believe that there are opportunities here, and we believe that being able to raise revenue to fund all of the priorities that we have is going to be really important in the upcoming years, and that we really believe that with a long-term lens, we will be able to achieve some more of these measures to bring some balance to our tax code. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadaf. Appreciate that additional context about everything happening in Florida and the history. It's very helpful. I'm going to turn it now over to Phineas Baxandall, who, as I mentioned before, is the interim president of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. As Carl mentioned in his remarks, there have been some really good tax changes happening in Mass over the last few years, and that has really helped improve that state's rankings on the tax inequality index that is in the Who Pays report, and also just the well-being of a lot of people in the Bay State. So without further ado, Phineas, you want to take it away?
Thanks, John, and thanks, Sadaf, Carl, Aiden. I'm glad to be here today. And really glad to see this report. I feel like this report is one which has been such a mainstay for so many years as sort of the most in-depth and sort of state-by-state analysis on tax incidents. And it's really only this year where I feel like I've truly understood and appreciated its title. It's, a simple title as Who Pays? And, here in Massachusetts, we're also often hearing, sort of, are we a high tax state? How high tax? Who's low tax? And this report just really drives home how it's sometimes like high tax or low tax is almost missing some of the larger questions, because it's a state can have a tax system which is high tax for some people and low tax for other people, and that's what we've really seen with these transformations that we have in Massachusetts. And so, we had, as was mentioned, we had what was called the millionaire's tax. It was a 4% income tax just on the income over $1 million, in this additional 4% on top of the regular 5% income tax we have. And then we had a sort of less consequential in some ways for this, for the results here, but also important, especially at low income levels. There was a tax package that happened in Massachusetts and signed not that many months ago that introduced and buttressed some really good refundable low income credits for people who have low income and people just based on having a dependent. And those able to really see how that changes the amount that people on the lower end and well, in the lower end especially, are paying in taxes as a share of their income. And so there were also, as part of that, some estate tax cuts and some other things which may end up being harder to afford in the long term. But as a package of things, it really changed where we sit in this who pays report, and it's just great to see that. And what it reveals is that for most households, specifically those in the middle and those in the lower income end, Massachusetts is a low tax state. I'm going to say that again because it's something so contrary to what people repeat over and over again. For most people, Massachusetts is a low tax state. You pay where you sit in the income stream, you pay a lower share of your income than most other states. For the middle 60% of our tax filers, you pay a lower share of your income than people in the middle 60% do in 32 other states. For those in the bottom 40%, you pay a lower share of your income than you do in Florida, in Texas, or in 35 other states. So it is just really gratifying to see the results of policy. As you say, this is a policy choice, how regressive or progressive our taxes are. And, we know there's still work to do. There's, 9 states, as well as Washington, D.C., where the top 1% carry a larger share pay a larger share of their income. And we're not, in the report, we're not even quite a progressive tax state. There are 6 other states, including our neighbors in New York, in Maine, in Vermont, where they have truly progressive tax systems, where those who pay more, who have higher incomes, pay a larger share of their income in state and local taxes. And maybe we will get there sometime in Massachusetts. We're not there quite yet, but it is really gratifying to see how policy changes, like the policy changes that we had, moved us all of these places. We would have, 2 years ago, 17 states would have had tax systems more equitable than Massachusetts, instead of 7, including DC, that do. So it's really gratifying to see how much policy matters, and it's really gratifying to really see the work of ITEP, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, showing the importance of asking this question: who pays? Who is it who is paying the tax money? We know in Massachusetts, the fact that this tax money is being generated from the millionaire's tax is the reason why school lunch, free school meals is going away here, or it is in so many other states. The reason why we're not having to do all these cutbacks on early education, why we're able to do a bunch of investments, where we have regional transit, which is free in many areas across the state, and we're getting improvements around the state. Almost every municipality is extra money for fixing roads, all of these things which would not have happened if not for that millionaire's tax. So there's a lot to celebrate here today, including this just excellent report. Thank you.
Thank you, Phineas. Appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions from everyone. We've got a couple of folks who've already put questions in the queue, and we'll start with those. But in the meantime, if you've got a question, again, please type it into the Q&A if you can. If you'd rather, you can raise your hand in Zoom, and I could unmute you when it comes around, or as a real fallback, you can do the chat. The first question is from Jason Garcia in Florida. And I'm going to send this one to Carl, I think. Can you explain what caused Florida's tax structure to become more regressive than Texas? Are there some specific policies that either state enacted that contributed to the flip, or is it the result of a methodology change?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. The first thing I'll say is, if you look at the very most regressive states, places like Florida, Washington, Texas, all these systems look quite similar.